it's really great to have you here, Dr. Raji. So it's a pleasure and honor for you to join in this little discussion session. It's more like our first session here. So I'm Chia, Chief Editor of ANBOUND Malaysia. So calling from Kuala Lumpur in our Malaysian office. So good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me out here. And this is an exciting time to discuss some of the very pertinent issues as far as the bilateral relations between India and China are concerned. Some interesting times we live in Asia Pacific. So
yes, indeed. So as we know, India and China are two of the world's largest developing countries, and they are the largest emerging economies in the world. So, and now, as you said, this is an interesting time, and both countries are facing challenges like the coronavirus issues and the impact of the economy. And recently, there's this disputes over the border issues. So we are glad to have you here to share with us your perspectives and your valuable opinions. So maybe for starter, you can share a bit with us about the coronavirus situation, the COVID-19 situation in India.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chia. Of course, happy to be here in this conversation because I think the Indo-Pacific developments are so fluid. And like you said, much of the region has been reeling under the COVID-19 pandemic. So how each of the countries have managed to address this particular issue from the health point perspective, but also from the economic and social perspective, because all of us have a huge social impact now because most people are working from home. But there are a whole lot of people who have lost their jobs. So there are multiple perspectives to look at this issue from, in a sense. The full impact of the coronavirus pandemic is not very clear as yet because the numbers in India are still climbing because we were under a 3-month lockdown extended 2 times. So we are still, we are just beginning to kind of relax the rules. People are just beginning to go out. So it's and of course, the numbers are going up precisely because of the exposure. So I don't think we have peaked yet. So unless you have peaked and then the numbers begin to come down, you cannot make a realistic assessment of the situation and the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on multiple domains, whether it is in the economic, social, and of course, the economic impact is going to be the most serious one. Already some of the credit ratings on India have come down. There are also the India's own assessment given the where we are today, the defense budget allocation has already been slashed. So you are beginning to see the impact of the economy already play out in the national security as well as defense domain. So it's pretty severe, I would think, but I think a fuller assessment can be made only when the situation is under control in that sense, and we are somewhere out of the danger, so to say.
So you have mentioned that the impact of COVID-19 on the economy in general. So in terms of consumer activities, so how do you see the impact?
So right now it is pretty much, it's very, very low because even though the malls and shopping complexes have been open for close to a month, I would think, I think still people are not willing to go out for the fear of catching the infection and being infected and the long-term damages that may do to the system. People don't want to, people have got such a fear in their minds that even though the economy has opened partially, they don't want to step out of their houses to go to the shopping complex to buy things and so on and so forth. People are essentially moved to an online platforms to buy things. But again, those are limited to, more or less limited to buying the essential stuff, essential household stuff, and so on and so forth. People are not buying any luxurious stuff at this point of time, certainly not through online platforms. So the consumer activities have come down significantly in the last 3-4 months. I think certainly from about March onwards, this has seen a lower, it's been on a low, all-time low at this point of time.
Yeah, I think this is a common situation in a lot of countries, including here in Malaysia. Exactly. So right. Moving on to the next topics. So in the topics concerning the border disputes, the tension that happened recently, so we see that violence still occurs even after President Xi Jinping's visit to India last year. So, does India think that the India-China relations are still under control, or are there any other factors that are uncontrollable on both sides?
Okay. No, that's a good question, especially given the current situation. I think for a long time, there was a sense that Sino-Indian border along the line of actual control was one of the more stable one, unlike the line of control which separates India and Pakistan. But I don't think I can say that anymore in the case of India-China relations, that it is one of stability and certain amount of predictability along the border. There have been increasing number of incidents in different sectors along the Sino-Indian border, particularly since President Xi Jinping came to office in 2012. So in 2013, again in Ladakh, we had the Depsang crisis, which went on for a long time. Then you had the 2014, again in the Ladakh region in Chumur. 2017, something that everybody has come to know, the Doklam crisis that happened for 71 days. And then, of course, now the current Galvan crisis. But in the meantime, there have been several more intrusions, incursions, fistfights, stone pelting incidents all over the border areas in a sense. So the border has not been a quiet one for quite some time now. So if the question is that if these are controllable, I would say no. The kind of agreements, for instance, that sustained or maintain some semblance of peace and stability on the border, they are no more effective. This is possibly because there can be a number of attributions that can be made as to why China is doing what it is doing. But I think one of the most pertinent points in this regard is that China has become far too strong and powerful, and it believes that everyone should play by China's rules, and this may not work. And I think that's a crux of the issue in a sense, because India does not want to. India and China for the past have agreed that these are contested areas, these are disputed areas, and both sides have to sit together and work out a political solution. A military solution is not going to be the way forward. But China this time around have tried to unilaterally change the status quo on the ground. And I think that's why we have seen the current tensions growing in a sense.
So this tension, in general, among the Indian societies, the wider Indian societies, how do the Indians in general view this incident?
Especially after the Galvan crisis, Galvan clash, which happened on June 15th, which involved 20 fatalities on the Indian side. And I believe there are a few numbers on the PLA on the Chinese side, but China has not really come out with the numbers as yet. After the Galvan clash, I think there is a huge, significant public anger. There's massive public backlash against China. In fact, one of the recent survey, I'll give you a sampling of the survey. One of the questions that was asked was, what do you think of China's actions vis-a-vis India? 50.9% said it befits that of an enemy nation. 34.8% said it is just posturing. And 14% said they don't have a view. On a second question, how do you view China generally? 83% unfavorably, 6.3 favorably. And on a third question, how has the opinion changed towards China in recent weeks? 63.2% said deteriorated. 5.3% said improved. Perception of China, again, 1 to scale, close to 61% said most unfriendly, 15.3% unfriendly, and the friendly was just 2.3%. And so in a sense, I think the public sentiment is extremely negative towards China, given the anger towards the killing of the 20 Indian Army personnel, including an Indian Army officer. I think this is very understandable as to why this is happening. And what can be done to undo the negative consequences of this particular incident, it is not very clear yet. But the public anger is very understandable at this point of time.
So we understand that there's this public anger among the Indian general public towards incidents like this. So do you think that the nationalistic sentiments in India play a role? As we know, there's this nationalistic sentiments among the Indians and the Chinese in recent times. So what role do you think this nationalistic sentiment play in this?
I would say that the sentiment, for instance, the nationalist sentiment that you're referring to, largely follows the government views in the case of in the case of China. And when you look at the Modi government's efforts, the government has been trying very hard to maintain an even keel, a somewhat more balanced, a very nuanced sort of an approach towards China, despite the acknowledgement of some of the serious problems that exist between India and China. Prime Minister Modi has taken several steps, including the Wuhan summit, the first informal summit that happened between India and China after the Doklam crisis, and then followed up with the further summit in South India in last year. So Prime Minister Modi has given this an extra edge to walk that space, to walk that extra mile, to keep the relationship on an even keel, on a very balanced, nuanced perspective. But I think the nationalist sentiments that you're seeing out today is more in the case of Pakistan. I would not say that that has really been in the case of China because of the government efforts. So the current sentiments that you're seeing is very, very close to the Galvin crisis that happened. And therefore, I would say that that could be possibly a temporary phenomena. The nationalist sentiments being played out is possibly a temporary phenomena. But otherwise, they have generally followed the government efforts, which has been to find a middle ground, find an accommodating posture with that of China.
So we have also noticed that there are certain parties, certain sections in India, for example, Swadeshi Jagran Manch, the economic wing of RSS, it actually called for the boycott of Chinese goods and rejecting Chinese investment. So how common is this view among the Indian society? So is there a consensus among the politicians and the business community on this issue? And how does it affect the bilateral commerce activities and investments?
So a couple of different questions. I think the first bit is that previously, for instance, groups like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch have not had much of an influence or a play with regard to government policies. They did come out with various statements from time to time, but they were not given much importance despite the fact that they are a wing of the RSS, like you said. But the current call for economic boycott and the government taking certain steps in stopping the Chinese investments may be seen in the context, purely seen in the context of the Galvin clash. So I would think that this is this is more of a temporary step because given the proximity of the Galvin crisis that has happened, these steps are kind of immediate and temporary steps. But I'm not too sure it's going to be the case that these kind of voices would have a larger kind of a presence in the Indian policy making. But there is a larger angle, like I said in the beginning, that at China across different stakeholders, and therefore one is likely to see a momentum for cutting China off when it comes to trade and economic domains. You've already seen this kind of playing out. The Maharashtra government, one of the eastern provinces in Maharashtra, they have cancelled the sort of a project with one of the infrastructure projects with the Chinese companies. Second, the Bihar government of the East again has taken a step to cancel two of the MOU signed with two of the Chinese companies in this regard. So there is a conscious set of actions taken by the different state government, provincial governments, but also at the central level, the national government is also sort of taking certain steps to, for instance, the banning of the Chinese apps. For instance, 59 Chinese apps have been banned from any of the operations in India. So there are certain steps that are being taken. But again, I think this could be more of a temporary phenomena that you would see rather than a long-term one. I'm not entirely sure how long this will last, play out in the Indian case in a sense.
So geopolitically speaking, so India and China are neighbors. So, and the United States and Europe are on the other side of the world. So how does geopolitics and geography decide India-China relations and their cooperation?
Okay, absolutely. I think geopolitics plays a huge role in every major relationships. It's the case. If you looked at, for instance, the 21st century is supposed to be the Asian century, but the reality is that Asia doesn't present itself as a unified house, that it's a so divided a house. And that's also partly because you have several rising powers at the same time. The simultaneous rise of China, India, and a new normal nation in Japan, or even the return of Russia as a major power. Again, all of this has given way to more competition and rivalry playing out in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, Europe and the US are clearly not our neighbors, and therefore you are likely to have much lesser problem with them. You are not going to get into a fight. You don't have a historical baggage of that kind. Whereas China's relationship with each of the major powers, whether it is China, Russia, China, Japan, China, India, it's the history is so heavy. The baggage of history weighs so strongly in each of these bilateral relations. With the countries having gone into war with each other, there are unresolved border and territorial problems. So the sovereignty issues, all of that come into play in each of China's major power relations, whether it is so China, Japan, China, India. And you see this kind of playing out repeatedly in the last several years, but in the last few months also, at least even when the region is reeling under the pressure of the COVID-19, which again itself is China has been responsible in some ways for the spread of the pandemic. It could have been controlled if this was taken care of at the very beginning. Uh, but even under the COVID-19 situations, you see a China, an aggressive China that is pushing around all of its neighbors, pushing in a very aggressive manner. Starting from January, if you look at, for instance, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Indonesia has been, some of these countries have been so reluctant to speak out against China because of the economic linkages and so on and so forth. But the manner in which China was engaged in the naval intrusions in Indonesia's exclusive economic zones in the Natuna Islands has actually pushed certain limits within for Indonesia. Similar is the case with Malaysia, where the US and Australian ships were doing a show of strength in support of Malaysia. The Philippines came out strongly against China's behavior. Despite having a government that is somewhat soft in China, you have the Philippines taking a very strong stand, even after the sinking of the Vietnamese fishing vessel. So the number of incidents, and then of course on the east, you have the the PLA pushing itself onto the Japanese waters, but also onto the very close to the Taiwanese air defense zone and so forth. So there have been, and India possibly has been the last of the countries in the neighborhood that has come to bear the brunt of the Chinese sort of aggressive behavior. So with a China that is so problematic in that sense because of the history, but also because there are unresolved border, territorial, and sovereignty issues, things are not going to be easy. And we share a neighborhood, and precisely because we are neighbors, we are two large neighbors who have engaged in economic relationship and for the betterment of the people on both sides of the border. There has been certain effort from the Modi government and previous governments to maintain an even keel, a balanced relationship, at least a decent working relationship with China, so that we don't get into a fight, we don't get into a conflict. But China's unilateral tendencies to change the status quo on the ground, I think that clearly calls for an action, for a response from all of its neighbors. This is what we are kind of beginning to see play out in the case of every neighbor trying to push back on China's aggressive behavior. Going by one of the recent essays in the War on the Rocks, at least a Chinese scholar has written this essay, trying to provide a Chinese perspective on trying to explain the Galvan crisis between India and China. She essentially says that this is possibly a China that is so paranoid about everybody. If a nation is so paranoid, then there is very little that other countries can do to kind of patch up or calm the tempers and so on and so forth. So I'm not too sure what exactly and how exactly this is going to end and where we are going to land. But clearly the Indo-Pacific with it's going to be, we are going to be seeing a very competitive, very full of rivalry, competition, and the potential for conflict are very ripe in this region at this point of time. It's an unfortunate feature, I would think, of the current century.
So since we are talking about Indo-Pacific, so there's this Indo-Pacific strategy promoted by the United States. So to what extent is India's willingness to participate in this initiative, in this strategy?
Absolutely, wonderful question, because I think it flows again from the previous question. Uh, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy pursued by the United States is syncs well with India's own Act East policy, which is to have a fresh approach towards the Southeast Asian neighborhood, and this also syncs in line with the Japanese own foreign policy in this regard. So there is a congruence of interest among the US, India, Japan, and even maybe even Australia. Bring them into the mix, and you also have the Quad in place in a sense. So it fits well because I think again, nobody is talking about containing China, but how do we get China to play by the rules of the game? China has to shed its Middle Kingdom syndrome, and that its approach of a hegemonic world order, in a sense, hegemonic world order and a hegemonic Asia. That is not going to be acceptable to India or any of the neighbors, in a sense. That's going to be seriously problematic. India has repeatedly said that it is not going to be seeing, it will not allow for a hegemonic Asia to happen, in a sense, one single country to play or take a dominant role, in a sense. And I think that's been reiterated several different times by the Indian political leadership, as well as the former foreign secretaries, current foreign minister. All of them have talked about it. So you are going to get into a problem with each other, in a sense. But I think given the Galvan crisis, the current clash that is going on between India and China, I think India will push itself closer to the US and US allies even more fervently, because it is in India's interest to, because I think there are a couple of different factors that come into play. To manage the China threat, either India needs to have a very strong military, defense force, and I think there are several lacunae, several deficiencies on the Indian military side at this point of time. Last few years, the Indian defense budget has been falling. In fact, the lowest since the 1962 war. So that tells you about the deficiencies on the Indian military, Indian armed forces, and the kind of problems that are associated with it. Second, there are also life cycle driven modernization of its naval platforms, its air platforms that need to happen, which again call for more budget allocation. And in the current context of the COVID, I'm already seeing a budget further slashing of the defense budget allocation, which means that our defense capability, the hard power capability to manage the China problem is going to be very limited. And therefore, we need to be able to pursue diplomatic maneuvering, in a sense. There has to be an aggressive diplomatic push on the part of India to build up concrete ties, to strengthen some of the existing strategic partnership with those of the US, with Japan, Australia, France, maybe Canada. There are a whole lot of other countries. And of course, in the Southeast Asian countries, we look forward to a strengthened partnership with Indonesia, Singapore. Malaysia, we have had some troubles in the recent times from last year with President Mahathir making a few statements on India's Jammu and Kashmir policy. That has led to a bit of the standstill, a stalemate in the relationship. But I think Malaysia also remains one of the important partners. And especially when it comes to dealing with the China problem, for which the Indo-Pacific is one of the important kind of an approach, in a sense. We need all the players to be united. In that context, I would say, again, Indonesia needs to get on board with it, and ASEAN as a whole has come out with it, ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, AOIP. So it's very clear that all of these countries who are facing the Chinese brunt, Chinese aggressive behavior, are coming together in some form or the other. I'll give you the most recent example, the Quad Plus engagement. Quad countries themselves came back when it took a second avatar, so to say, a few years ago. But now there is even a talk about a Quad Plus engagement. Precisely, it came in the context of the COVID-19 to address the pandemic and what can be done, which involves 3 new countries, Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand. But I think this does have the potential to remain or become a strategic entity in the post-COVID world, or in the world also, because each of these countries have borne the brunt of Chinese aggressive behavior in their neighborhood. New Zealand, for instance, had a very typical approach like that of India, not wanting to take a clear side between China and the US, not taking any strong position on China and so on and so forth. But just like India, even New Zealand has had to take a strong, clear stand on China because of the Chinese push in the South Pacific Islands. So I think there are a number of these countries rallying together, coming together precisely to address the China problem, which is here to stay. And especially for a country like China under a leader like Xi Jinping, if they are so paranoid and if they are trying to divert the attention from a domestic problem, whether it is in terms of handling the COVID-19 or in terms of the misinformation and how China kind of hijacks certain multilateral institutions such as the World Health Organization, and how that all of that has boomeranged back on China. I think it does appear that Xi Jinping is trying to sort of negate those negative impact and therefore trying to divert the attention by creating these external hotspots, aggressive kind of push all around its neighborhood. But it's a very, very dangerous path to go down, because it can trigger unintentional conflicts between various countries, China and its various countries. And this is what happened on the on June 15 as well. I would not entirely say that this was completely unintentional, because China did come, it looked like they came pretty prepared for a full-on fight with India. And so in that sense, it was not entirely unpredictable, but I think certainly, like I said in the beginning, the certain amount of predictability and stability that existed in the case of India-China has gone away. So India will need to push the Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as the Quad and several other minilaterals in the case of the Indo-Pacific. So India will be giving a big push to many of these kind of engagements in the future.
So the final question is that what do you think China should do to improve the bilateral relations?
I think, yeah, it's very difficult to say what can be done. I think first and foremost is for China to acknowledge that there are disputed areas between China and its various neighbors, whether it is China and India, China and Taiwan, China and Japan on the East China Sea, or in the South China Sea with all of its neighbors. China has to acknowledge that use of force cannot find a permanent solution. Use of force, like it has done in the case of India-China currently, it might see a temporary victory for the PLA or President Xi Jinping, but it's not going to bring permanent peace to the border areas or the overall relations between China and these neighbors. India has tried its level best to maintain, like I said, by not taking a side with the US, for instance, on several instances. India has tried to follow the path of finding a middle ground in its foreign policy approaches. So while maintaining close relations with the US, Japan, and Australia, and so on and so forth, we have also kept up with for instance, the other two major groups that come to my mind are RIC, the Russia, India, China grouping. Then there is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa grouping. We have also been engaged in the non-alignment movement, NAM grouping. So in a sense, India has tried to find this multiple alignments to go in parallel, because clearly we didn't want to take one side or the other between the US and China. And we have resisted this for a very long time, because traditionally India did not want to play this balance power games anywhere with anybody. But increasingly, especially given the last major conflict, now the current sort of a Galvan crisis, Galvan clash, I think this has removed much of the inhibition. In fact, I'll also tell you that much of the elite sentiment within India, a lot of the people, former diplomats and other senior officials of the government of India who are now retired, who actually maintained a fairly vouch for a closer China-India relations, today are become extremely skeptical. They call for India to go for a stronger partnership with the Western communities, Western democracies, or even other Indo-Pacific regional partners, to go for a militarization of the Quad, to have a military alliance sort of a thing. So I do see a big shift in the elite sentiment also towards China, a big shift in the elite perception of within India towards China. So there is a big change. So unless, and I think the Galvin crisis has crossed certain limits. It's been a game changer moment in the India-China relations, because like I said in the beginning, there were a couple of agreements from 1993 and 1996. Then you have a 2003, 2012, a lot of border CBMs, confidence building measures, certain military CBMs, military agreements were put in place precisely to limit the potential for an open conflict. But and one of the situation was, one of the clauses in these agreements say that you will not use firearm. But the Galvan crisis showed that China was not using firearms, but they were getting to be so brutal, using barbed wires on sticks and so on and so forth, to essentially kill the soldiers on the Indian Army personnel so brutally. So even though they did not cross a certain line in using firearm, this has been far more brutal and far more violent. And therefore, I would think this is going to take several generations of people to now rebuild the kind of confidence in China and rebuild that relationship. After the 1962 war, it took several decades for India to regain that confidence in China that we can be friends, we can work together for a prosperous Asia. But I think that hope has been dashed off by China, which looked at a very short-sighted, in a very short-sighted approach. They killed that dashing hopes for hope for a peaceful, stable Asian order in a sense. So I think it's going to be a very long time for India to regain that confidence in China and rebuild that relationship. It's taken a huge beating. This is one of the worst lows in the bilateral relationship between India and China.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Raji, for sharing with us your perspective and your valuable opinions. So thank you so much for joining us this session this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.